Lesson 7 on changing laws in Britain 1955 to 1975. This is an extremely important lesson, and do pay close attention because this covers many different topics, both feminism, liberalization of policy, the death penalty, abortion, reproductive rights, birth control, family life, homosexuality.
Okay, so to understand the changes in laws in Britain, we need to look at this chap here, Roy Jenkins. He's a very, very liberal member of the Labour Party. Labour Party is traditionally more left-wing, and he served as Home Secretary. Now, so traditionally, this Home Secretary's job was to be the mean person in government. They were in charge of the police, in charge of justice, and they generally pushed a law and order, safe pair of hands. We are going to make sure people know their place, traditional values, course, no matter if they were Labour or Conservative. However, Roy Jenkins had a different idea of the role of government, and he believed that it was not the government's job to tell people what was moral and what was immoral, and therefore laws that were made back in the Victorian era which governed morality, so laws which made something illegal, not because it necessarily hurt society, but because it upset the morality of the people at the time. They thought, for example, homosexuality was distasteful, so therefore they made it illegal. That is wrong, and they should be repealed. Repeal basically means to get rid of. And he christened this, he wants to create this a civilized society. A civilized society where, yes, people don't go crazy, but the government does not regulate moral matters. Okay, there's a choice of an individual over their own life.
Now, what is liberalization? Well, generally speaking, from the early 60s to the mid-1970s, the British government will pass laws which cover important social issues. Liberalization means opening up or making more free and permissive or easy. So, for instance, they made divorce much easier to obtain. Abortion will be legalized. Homosexuality will be decriminalized, meaning that it will no longer be a crime to be homosexual in public, and ended capital punishment, meaning that there will be no people executed in this country for capital crimes, such as murder, etc.
So, the majority of this happened under Harold Wilson's Labour government, which was in power between 1964 and 1970s, right within the swinging 60s. And that is not an accident. The mood at the time, as we mentioned last lesson, was not with everyone, but the mood at the time, particularly amongst the top and the elites, was one of progress, of modernity. Harold Wilson got elected promising a modern, liberal, technical Britain to get its way out of the increasing economic problems, and Roy Jenkins serves as Home Secretary for pretty much most of this reign between 1964 and 70, and it's in this period where he does the majority of changes. On the side note, before this, between 1950 and 1964, there was another Liberal Home Secretary called Butler, R.A.B. Butler, like Downton Abbey. In fact, the guy who came up with the Butler Act in 1944, if you remember back to the Education Act lesson. However, he was in a Conservative government which did not want change. So although he wanted change to homosexuality and all the stuff we're going to look at, he couldn't get it because his party still liked the traditional values and stood for those traditional British values. So when we're looking at this course and looking at the changes, this is not something that happens over 20 years. This is a brief flurry that ends in the 70s when the Conservative government comes back. However, no government really reverses the trends up until this date. So the stuff that is changed isn't unchanged, as it were. But it's important to realise that this happens in the context of the 60s, where people want change, it's all about modernity, and it's all about freedom. So if we look at Britain in 1955, this is a very, very traditional Britain. If you were a single mother, you were shunned. Even if you were unmarried, you were shunned. Very often, girls who get pregnant accidentally before the time, they end up having to give their child to their mothers to raise. Because obviously the mother's already married, they can have a child, and no one really asks any questions why they have, after a gap of 18 years, they have a new baby. And for many years, and even to this day, there are individuals who are raised thinking that their sister is actually their sister is a sister, when actually it's their mother. Additionally to this, the values of marriage were very, very strict and very, very based on on what the man wants. Women could only get really divorced on a really exceptional circumstances. When we compare that to later on, that's not very much not the case. But for example, marital rape didn't exist. You couldn't rape your wife, and actually it's far easier for men to get divorces in 1955 if they had been cheated on than the other way around.
Now, in addition to that, in 1955, there's no female contraceptive pill available. By 1975, female contraceptive pill is widely available, which gives women a lot more choice in when they're going to have babies. In 1955, capital punishment was the norm for crimes such as murder. By 1975, capital punishment had been abolished altogether. In 1955, it was extremely difficult to end a marriage, as Mr. Suter just said, especially if you're a woman. And then by 1975, divorce was much easier to obtain for both sexes, men and women, most particularly women, and it was also more accepted to be a divorced person. And lastly, homosexuality between men was illegal and a punishable offense. And in 1975, homosexuality between men over the age of 21 was illegal. Interesting note there, it was almost inconceivable to the lawmakers of the time that homosexuality could be a woman's issue as well. The idea of being a lesbian wasn't necessarily something on the sort of forefront of people's minds. Homosexuality was seen as something between men primarily. Now, important note, although these laws were passed, and we'll review them all in a second, it did not mean that all people had just woken up and become liberal and accepting. Some people held on to their traditional ideas. They take a long time to change, and they would fight this liberalization. A multicultural Britain, the Britain that's evolving in the 1970s, needs to be contrasted with the deeply held religious beliefs of, one might argue, the majority of Brits.
So one of the first major changes was the death penalty. Death was outlawed. Death by hanging was outlawed except for treason and piracy in 1965. And this was in part due to three major cases. It's the case of Bentley, Ellis and Evans. Just to use Bentley for the sake of time, Bentley was part of a robbery of a warehouse with a younger 15-year-old partner in crime. A police officer catches them and the partner in crime pulls out a gun and shoots the police officer dead. Now, obviously, the 15-year-old accomplice, the person who did the killing, is seen as too young to suffer the death penalty, so he is in prison for life. But the government want to make a point, and the courts want to make a point, and they say the fact that Bentley had used the phrase "let him have it" as incitement to murder, and therefore hung him as joint enterprise. Basically, he is just as guilty as a murderer as anyone else. Now, there's a lot of controversy, first whether this was right, since he didn't pull the trigger, but also what he meant by "let him have it." Did he mean let him have it, shoot the police officer, or did he mean let him have it, give the gun to the police officer? And there's a lot of issues like that. Again, Ellis and Evans, okay, she killed her abusive partner after a cascade of abuse, and while he was assaulting her. But apart from that, she was still arrested, tried, and hung for his murder. And this mobilized a lot of public support, particularly as you see that 50,000 people started the significant campaign, which was ignored. And finally, in 1960, Timothy Evans was arrested, tried, and hung for murder of his baby daughter. Now, later on, it was found out to be innocent, and even at the time, there were questions about whether he was guilty of this, or this was something called cot death, where children die almost for unexplained reasons because of the position in which they sleep at night. This got a huge public outcry, and one of the biggest arguments against death penalty was not that it was immoral. And actually, when we look at this, and we look at the death penalty, it remains popular. I mean, remains popular to this day. If you ask the vast majority of Britons if child murderers or serial rapists or serial killers deserve to get a death penalty, a lot of people would say yes. But how does Timothy Evans and a couple of others shape the argument is people say you cannot be sure that you are right. And if you kill someone and they turn out to be innocent, then you cannot take that back like you would if you imprisoned someone. So the death penalty ends up being outlawed in 1965. But it's wrong to say the vast majority of people support this. In fact, actually, the vast majority of people are against this. And it takes a very long time, well into the 80s, before more than 50% of people in Britain support not having a death penalty. And so while we say this is a triumph of liberalism, many of the people would prefer there still to be a death penalty for certain extreme crimes.
Now, the case with abortion is quite interesting. One of the most significant changes in liberalization was the fact that by the end of this period, women were allowed to obtain abortions. Now, in the 1950s and certainly in the 1960s, being unmarried, a woman, pregnant, was shameful. For those people who were pregnant, those women who were pregnant, often the fact that they were pregnant was a closely guarded family secret. Girls or teenagers or women who were still in school would be sick and at home for a period of 9 months until the baby was born, and often given up for adoption. It was impossible to live in this country as a single mother. And as a result, most of the kids were either raised by their family, as Mr. Suter alluded to, as the sibling of the married grandparents, or adopted or given up for adoption. In addition to this, I guess one of the great shames, if you will, for lack of a better word, was the fact that 200 homes exist for unmarried mothers in this country in the 1950s, and the last of them don't close down until the 1960s. Half of the people in these homes were teenagers. Now, these homes were often in the countryside, sort of out of the sight of the general public, and pregnant women would be sent there. Until they carried their baby to term, had the baby, and the baby was given up for adoption. These are horrible places. The standard of care was low. The food was terrible. The hygiene and the cleanliness oftentimes also very low. There wasn't a lot of care for good hygiene and the health of the mother. These things just weren't regarded as necessary for people who did things outside of the social norms, such as have a baby out of wedlock. In some extreme cases, mothers were used as cheap labor, and in many sense, it was almost like a slave home. Now, the reality was that rather than living with these homes, women began to choose the other option, and this is the option that was illegal. There were a number of doctors, and in many more cases, people who were not doctors, performing illegal abortions, commonly known as backstreet abortions. Now, the legalization of abortion didn't come as a great wave of liberalism, whereas people in government decided, well, it's unfair that we have all of these women living in single mother homes. Let's legalize abortion and give women some choice over their destiny, and that it didn't happen like that. It was really the horror of these backstreet abortions that drove legislators to ban or to make abortion legal. Now, it was an enormously controversial law. The government couldn't pass it as a law for liberalization and openness. It had to pass the law as a public health issue rather than a social reform. They said poor women were resorting to these backstreet abortions and that it was costing the NHS millions of pounds. They had to treat 35,000, this is actually a real statistic, 35,000 botched abortions before 1967, and it was this cost and the social the cost of the social health system that was necessitating the pass of an abortion legalization laws where women could get abortions on the NHS. These factors led some MPs to support the legalization of abortion. Now, the legalization of abortion comes about in 1967. A couple things also help push it forward. Number one, the use of a drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug put out in 1958 to help women with morning sickness. Now, the drug wasn't tested properly, and what it did do was led to a majority of women who used thalidomide having deformities in their child at birth. Abortion was seen as a way to prevent the birth of accidentally seriously deformed babies by thalidomide, and pro-abortion campaigners used it to push their cause forward. Now, 4 times between 1953 and 1966 did they try and pass an abortion bill, and all 3 times it was defeated. Opposition concentrated in the Catholic Church and within Parliament, and there were deeply opposed to this on religious grounds. Now, a Labour MP named David Steele will introduce a private members bill in 1967, which will allow the law to pass. Now, a private members bill is different than a traditional bill. A private members bill is something passed on the back benches of Parliament.
So David Steele was in fact a Liberal, and he was encouraged by the Labour Home Secretary, who insisted that he didn't want to bring it in himself because that would make Labour look a little bit too unpopular. But Liberals stood more clearly for abortion rights and all these sort of liberal social policies, and so therefore David Steele passes this bill, suggests this bill to Parliament. The Labour Party then supports it, and it gets passed, as Mr Raine has correctly identified, as a public health measure rather than as everyone deserves an abortion. But what is interesting about this is that Labour Party felt like it would lose too much support by making the law itself, so it got a Liberal MP, who the Liberals weren't in power at the time, to suggest this bill instead.
That's an interesting point, and it goes further to your point on the death penalty. As is the case in the death penalty, is the case with abortion as well. One might argue that the overwhelming majority of Brits do not want the abortion bill passed in the 1960s, though it is passed as a public health issue by a relatively progressive Labour government. As a result, abortions will rise dramatically. Up to 140,000 abortions are performed in 1979. Its popularity and use steadily increases, though many will remain opposed for various grounds to its legalization.
So another thing to be liberalised is the use of birth control. Now, birth control has two major advantages for, and particularly for a Liberal government. Number one, it gives reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies, particularly amongst younger unmarried women, usually teenagers. So it limits these unwanted children from occurring. The other thing it does, which is slightly more bigger picture, and it's more important when we go on to the feminism stuff later, is it gives women the choice to control their own bodies, whether they are married or whether they are single. Now, it used to be almost a sentence on their career. As soon as you become married, you are not going to use birth control, and therefore going, because there aren't any, and then therefore you're going to get pregnant within a year or two, and that's the end of your career. If a woman can now use birth control because it's legal, she can now delay children until she is happy or with her career, or she wants to. So it's about this idea of women are no longer just vessels for children, women are no longer just mothers, they actually can be increasingly independent. So the government, with this in mind, wanting to limit unwanted pregnancies, and that's what it really pushes, because it scares people less than if you say, I'm going to make your wife have a career, starts pushing for more and more birth control. So condoms were cheap and were readily available, but many didn't use them for reasons of manufacturing or personal preference. So the pill becomes more available and gets introduced to on the NHS in 1961. This is seen as a way of reducing abortions, but widely criticised in some quarters as essentially legitimising, that means basically saying it's fine, risky sexual practices and sex outside of marriage. And as a result, it's not really that widely used. There are some worries that taking the pill will have side effects, including cancer. Many doctors actively resist prescribing this because they didn't feel it's right to stop the natural flow of birth that Christian England viewed as at the time as standard and as what should be expected, and the Catholic Church also forbids its use, and therefore we find that it's not even available for married women until 1967, unmarried women until 1967, and even then unmarried women will find it very difficult in some places, particularly more religious areas, to get the birth control pill that they ask for. So then there's an increasing shift towards sexual education to reduce abortion, and this is generally a little bit more popular because you have a bit more control over it, and it's also a little bit less less controversial than abortion. So they introduced a Family Planning Act in 1967, where local authorities were given permission to give family planning advice. That's usually sex education in school or elsewhere. And then from early 1970s, contraception and STD prevention were taught in schools. And this is a major change from 1955, where sex wouldn't be mentioned at all, and if it was, it will be along the lines of traditional gender roles and traditional use of man and woman ideas of power relationships between couples. The story of birth control then is increasing proliferation, increasing amounts of birth control, but still not massively used. And there is a large group, usually Christian or more traditional, who see the rise of birth control as a sign of the decline of the times. And this is something we keep coming back to with abortion, birth control, family life, and homosexuality. People are increasingly worried that England is going to fall and burn like ancient Rome. A lot of comparisons to ancient Rome are made, a bit grandiose for Britain to think of itself as ancient Rome, but that's how we roll. But essentially, they see this as Britain has become less moral, more corrupt, and there are going to be far more problems.
So by the mid-1970s, general changes in attitudes meant that more unmarried mothers were able to live as single parents. Single-parent families increased with changes to divorce laws, and it was not only accepted, it was more common. In the 1960s, divorce was only permitted in the case of adultery, until the Divorce Act of 1969 will allow for divorce for what this comes to be quoted as the irretrievable breakdown of a marriage. The Divorce Reform Act said a couple that spent 2 years living apart and both wanted it could receive a divorce, or a couple that had spent 5 years living apart and one wanted it but the other didn't could then receive a divorce. By 1975, the number of divorces was 1/3 the number of marriages, and is quite actually to this day closer to half than it is the 1/3 number. But the Family Life Act and the sort of Divorce Reform Act meant that people, especially women most notably, could obtain divorces and get out of either abusive or unhappy marriages. Just a side note, before that, during the 1950s and before, if a woman wanted to get out of her marriage, she would have to prove adultery. And having to prove adultery usually required getting something like photographic or video evidence. And it was almost unthinkable for people of the middle and lower classes to get that evidence, because you would need to hire rather expensive private investigators to do this for you, to catch your husband cheating on you and so on and so forth. And this wasn't an easy task to do in the first place. Nevertheless, until 1969, women were effectively trapped by marriage, even if that marriage was abusive or unhappy. The Divorce Reform Act of '69 will allow divorce under the two conditions I mentioned earlier. The other major change has to do with homosexuality. In the late 1950s, some well-known figures were in prison for homosexuality. For any of you who have watched the movie The Imitation Game about Alan Turing, the famous Bletchley Park codebreaker, you might know a little bit about this and the social stigma it was placed on men who were homosexual. In 1957, as a result of some of the imprisoning of homosexuality and the bribery that was going on, a lot of really well-known people who were gay were being bribed and extorted for money in return for keeping the secret that they were gay. It was a terrible situation to be in. But in 1957, the Lord Wolfenden Report recommends that it be decriminalized, that is, being homosexual, for people 21 and over. 10 years will pass before the 1967 Sexual Offenses Act decriminalizes homosexuality for those who are 21 and over. And again, the main reason, similar to the Abortion Act, was not to endorse homosexuality, but to prevent blackmail. And again, this was a private members act.
I think, and that's a very, very key point for this whole course. There seems to be a common theme emerging here, that the government, this Liberal government, who do want this change and do genuinely believe in homosexuality reform, believe in changes to family planning, family life, and legalisation of abortion, they always justify it by saying, oh, it's not because we like homosexuality, it's because of this random reason. It's not because we like birth control, it's because of this random reason. We don't like because we like the end of death penalty, it's because of this random reason. And this tells you the fact that the government was that worried that it's going to lose mass support by supporting this openly, that they have to almost hide it behind excuses. Okay, and this definitely shows the fact that throughout this course and throughout up until 1979, when it was the end of this unit, the vast majority of people had relatively negative views for the most of the stuff we've looked at already. So they didn't perhaps like the homosexuality reform, the changes to family life, and the end of the death penalty in particular. And they saw all of this as a symptom of Britain's moral and social decline.
Now, just to review quickly, you got the 1965 banning of the death penalty. In 1969, you have the legalization, or 1967, you have the legalization of abortion as a private member's bill. In 1969, you have the Divorce Act being changed, so there's the Divorce Reform Act of 1969, which makes divorce more easy to obtain. And in 1967, you have homosexuality decriminalized. All of the acts mentioned ran counter to the majority of the wishes of the British people, but are important laws for the openness and the creation of a more permissive, civilized society as envisioned by Home Secretary Roy Jenkins.